This is a presentation of the WELS Historical Institute and Friends of the Salem Landmark Church Museum. Welcome to the 2010 Summer Series, Great Sermons of the Past, marking important events in the history of the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod. This is the first of 3 presentations. An 1860 sermon by Johann Sieker, pioneer pastor to early German immigrants at Granville, Wisconsin. With historical setting provided by Mark Jeske, pastor in Milwaukee at St. Marcus Lutheran Church and host of the TV ministry Time of Grace. Presented in the Salem Landmark Church of Granville, built under Pastor Sieker after the birth of the Wisconsin Synod here in 1850.
We are here now to visualize as he reads a portion of Pastor Sieker's sermon. He's going to do it. Give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Dan. Mighty good to be here. I have a great affection for Salem for many reasons, and most of you old-timers remember Pastor Nummenson. He and my father were classmates and dear friends, and so that would bring my dad and my family out here to visit now and then. And I was not only a charter member of the WELS Historical Institute, I also was a charter member of the founding board of it. I chose the theme for the Great Seal and did the first sketches for the seal of the WELS Historical Institute way back in the early 80s, and thrilled to have played a little bit of a role in getting this started. And it's been my first visit to the Historic Landmark Church in a few years, and I'm absolutely thrilled to see how it's developing. What a thrill, especially if you're a Salem old-timer, to see how this piece of your history and this piece of WELS history is being preserved. Knowing how to do that. I live in a house built in 1880, and I live in a congregation, serve in a congregation that's in one of Milwaukee's oldest neighborhoods, and we have probably acquired somewhere between 18 and 20 lots over the years, and I have personally supervised the destruction of plenty of Victorian buildings, and know that you just can't save them all. Some are too far gone, and things have to make economic sense to save. You can't save everything. You have to be selective and carefully invest what's worth preserving. And I am thrilled to be standing in this historic space with you today, and thrilled that somehow the Institute and Salem Church have managed to keep this beautiful little piece of our history alive. I come before you today pretty wounded. First of all, I am disappointed to say I forgot to bring my reading glasses. I'm aging fast, and now I know why my grandmother used to say when I'd be reading a book in a corner, she'd say, "You don't have enough light over there." And I'd say, "What do you mean, Grandma? I got plenty of light." Now I know what she means. But also, I discovered a couple of days ago I have pneumonia. So other than being blind and having not much voice, I feel fine. I brought a couple of things along I'm going to pass around just as I start, and I would hope that by the time I'm done, this will have worked its way through the whole thing. How many of you had heard of the name Johann Sieker before today? Raise your hand if you know that name. Okay, less than half, I'd say, as I look at the people here. So you might not know what he looks like. I've got a picture of him, young, medium, and old. See if you can figure out which is which. One of them is an anniversary book from Trinity Lutheran Church in St. Paul, Minnesota, where he served in the middle part of his career. One is a brief history of the Diamond Jubilee of the Synodical Conference, and he was one of he was the main force that brought his synod, the Minnesota Synod, into the original Synodical Conference in 1872. And I also have one of the old history books of the Minnesota district, and his presidential portrait is in there, probably his best picture that I've been able to find. So I'll pass these around if you enjoy looking at them. So please be gentle, they're from my personal library and they're irreplaceable. Well, to work. The story of Johann Sieker makes no sense in this context of Salem unless we go back a little before his time and review the absolutely crazy early history of Salem. And I don't know if there's any reason other than the grace of God why that congregation should have continued to exist. You had one of the wildest and woolliest beginnings I've ever heard. And incidentally, he did not speak. I'm going to read an excerpt of his first sermon at Salem, and it did not take place in this building nor behind anything that looked anything like that. He spoke across the street in a log cabin, which is all that Salem had to work with in those years, and I'll explain more about that later. In 1847, the German-English Evangelical Lutheran and Reformed congregation was organized on Christmas Day with about 20 families, primarily through the initiative of a man, probably a farmer, named Samuel Wambold. In German, I guess you'd say Wambold, who was elected an elder. Lay leaders led worship, and they would read sermons, a common practice in that day, which actually we're coming full circle. House churches are a very hot item in American church development today. Small group ministry and lay-led ministry is where all the growth is right now. And expensively trained, highly educated theologians who come in, who parachute in and try to do church planting is not working anymore. It's way too expensive, and we don't have the man, if you're in the ELCA, the woman power for it. And so we're coming, oddly enough, nearing 2 centuries later, we're coming full circle to this idea of lay-led conventicles that may or may not ever grow into a full-blown church. They would read sermons from Luther's Hauspostille, which were devotional literature. There's a rich devotional literature for home use, and these lay leaders would read that stuff. The first recorded use of the name Salem in synodical documents does not occur until 1867. So for the first 20 years, at least, of the life of this congregation, they simply called it the Lutheran Reformed Church in Granville, or the Granville Church. In 1848, the church's centennial history reports that a Reverend Ludwig Dulitz had been serving several churches in Milwaukee, one of which morphed into St. John's on 8th and Vliet. It was nowhere near 8th or Vliet Street in those years. It was, they were meeting in rented facilities on 4th and then on 5th Street. But the report said he was also coming out to Granville to serve the congregation. There's no other synodical records mention any work in this area by Dulitz. So I put an asterisk behind that little nugget of the person who might be considered Salem's first pastor. That the only reference to that is found in the rather, let's say, casually researched 1947 history. We're mighty glad for it, but I don't know if there's any further work been done on tracking the movements of Ludwig Dulitz. Dulitz, in the next year, in 1849, was mentoring a cobbler turned teacher from Germany by the name of Paul Meiss, M-E-I-S-S. President Mühlhäuser's history of the Synod says that an impatient Meiss abruptly disappeared from Dulitz's tutoring and appeared out here in Granville. And Dr. Arnold Lehman, the late sainted Dr. Lehman, theorized that that's why he was skeptical that Dulitz was ever here, because if he was serving here, how could Meiss have slipped away from his notice? Meiss, though, was here. So he's the first synodical worker, just a candidate. He had not been ordained at that time. He's the first one that, as far as I know, can be accurately stated to be working here in the Granville area. The Granville Church was willing to accept his services even though he was not ordained. He led revival meetings, however, rebaptizing 25 adult members, and this set off some shockwaves, even though the Lutherans and Reformed were willing to sort of live together. That was too much for the Lutheran half, and he was sort of pushed out. Mühlhäuser later reassigned him, still a candidate, still unordained, to a multiple parish in Schlesingerville. Okay, trivia experts, what is Schlesingerville known as today? Slinger. Man, you guys are sharp. Unbelievable. I heard at least 5 voices say the correct answer. That is, they call it Slinger today. although I think true historians should continue to refer to it as Schlesingerville. And by the way, a comment or two just on how could it be that you'd have a Lutheran and Reformed congregation? That sounds like a Lutheran and Catholic congregation, doesn't it? It's like, well, one or the other. How could you be both? There was an unfortunate track record for Lutheran and Reformed cooperating together, sometimes freely chosen, sometimes by compulsion, going all the way back to the forced Prussian Union. Back in North Germany, the sovereigns were tired of the constant fighting, and they just said, enough. All Protestants should learn to live together and get along. And some managed to do that. People who were truly serious about their Lutheranism, however, could never accept that, because no matter how you juggled it, when you came down to things like the Lord's Supper and the sacrament of baptism, there just were two very divergent views on these extremely important and central issues of our faith. And it was always an uneasy yoking wherever it happened. Anyway, in 1849, candidate Meis moves on. The congregation built its first church, basically a log cabin. So it's now in its second year. They probably were meeting in homes up till that point. Their first church cost $108.78. Was located next to the cemetery on the west side of the Granville Road. In December, the Granville Church called the newly arrived Langenberg Mission Society graduate Wilhelm Wrede, W-R-E-D-E. And he immediately met with Reverend Johann Weinmann from the Oakwood Church on South 27th Street, now in Oak Creek, and Mühlhäuser at the Milwaukee Church, which also was not called Grace initially, it was just called the Mühlhäuser's Church, and resolved in that December to form die Erste Deutsche Evangelische Lutherische Synode von Wisconsin. Mühlhäuser was elected president, Wrede was the treasurer, and Weinmann was the secretary. Now this was right after having arrived, so one of the very first things that Wrede did was realize we're hanging out there all alone. We got to have a team. We got to stick together or we're all going to be sunk. And I think that shows some great perception on his part. In 1850, the next year, the three pastors, with some candidates in training and one layman, adopted Mühlhäuser's constitution that he had written over the winter. And on May 26th, in 1850, they met at the Granville Log Church across the street, and they formed the German Evangelical Lutheran Ministerium of Wisconsin. And it would have separate ministerial and delegate meetings. This isn't unique to this little group. Many of the immigrant groups at that time had really two halves of the organization. There was the Ministerial Association that, like today, pretty much runs everything. Everybody knows the clergy runs the WELS. Lay people are along for the ride, but everybody knows you can talk all you want, but all the clergy have to do is stand up and start whipping Greek and Hebrew out, and those are like in Sheepshead, those are the queens, and they trump everything, and that's just how it is. I mean, anybody want to argue with me on that point? I'm being a little sarcastic, of course, but that trend of, do we want weak pastors? Heck no. There's one thing worse than overbearing pastors, and that's a weak clergy. But it is both a great strength and I think an inherent weakness within European American Lutheranism, that you have you put enormous effort in developing a very strong clergy, but one of the costs of that sometimes is an underdeveloped respect for lay ministry and leadership of laity. And this ministerium was the first organization to be formed, and its very second resolution was this name may never be changed, that it's both a ministerium, in other words, the leadership and power is vested in the clergy, and that it must be German until Judgment Day. And fortunately, that has been changed. I'm glad of that. Anyway, those were really the best of Salem's early years. When Pastor Wrede was here, the congregation grew and began to flourish. The town of Granville, if I can just offer a comment or two, Hardly anybody even knows what that is anymore, because it's just about completely evaporated, like a puddle of water on a sidewalk in August. There's almost nothing left except a few affectionate historic terms. It was named after a county in New York, which in turn was named after an earl in England. But Granville was once a gigantic portion of Milwaukee County, which when it finally reached its present shape in 1855, Milwaukee County was built around 8 townships. And if you sliced it from top to bottom, right down the middle, what street would that slice sit right on top of? 27th Street. Right now we think 27th Street is practically downtown. In the Civil War years, that was the far west side of the city of Milwaukee. And that was the middle axis that the townships were built around. And the west half of the townships, you had the township of Granville, gigantic piece of real estate that went all the way from the county line on 124th Street east, all the way to 27th Street. From the north end, which is now the county line with Mequon, and it went all the way down to Hampton Avenue. So 27th and Hampton had a Schwartzburg train station there. Right now, you think of 27th and Hampton as the deep hood, and yet that was part of the township of Granville, believe it or not. Then Wauwatosa, township of Wauwatosa, the township of Greenfield, which was enormous. Both of those were just as big, and then the township of Franklin underneath. There's almost nothing left of Granville because it's all been annexed by the city of Milwaukee. Just a few fragments are left. The West Granville Presbyterian Church still keeps the name. There's the Granville Road and cemetery and a few little fragments here and there, but that's about it. All right. Bad news for Salem. In 1853, Pastor Rady accepted a call to Baltimore, clearly no longer in the WELS. The WELS got off. If you ever want to know why the Missouri Synod and WELS developed differently, when the Missouri Synod's Constitution was signed in 1847, there were signers. They signed it in Chicago. There were signers from Chicago, St. Louis, Fort Wayne, Baltimore. In other words, they were a national organization right out of the chute and had not one but 2 seminaries churning out graduates. They also arrived with an infrastructure intact because of the Saxon migration that landed in St. Louis. They were a national organization ever since they started in 1847. When the WELS was organized in 1850, the only thing we had covered was Milwaukee County, because the signers were not from Chicago and Baltimore and Fort Wayne and Detroit. They were from northwest Milwaukee, central Milwaukee, and south part of Milwaukee. So we were only really a small regional group that, by sheer blessing of God, eventually morphed into a national organization. So there was a lot more coming and going back then. The WELS was a shaky little baby, and there was lots of coming and going and very little long-term stability. Milhäuser's long residence at his church downtown for, I think, 17 years was a huge blessing. So Pastor Rady goes to Baltimore, and the Synod Convention the previous summer had conditionally approved licensing a candidate named William Buren, who was a former Methodist. And the year Rady left in the 1853 convention, he was formally colloquized and ordained, and the Granville Church called him. Buren, however, heavily favored the Reformed side of the congregation, unlike Rady. And he soon induced the church to leave the infant Wisconsin Synod. And the Synod Convention in 1857 formally released or expelled Pastor Buren. And the German verb entlassen, there's a little bit of argument. The late Professor Lehman will never agree to that. Entlassen can mean giving somebody a peaceful release, but Kaler's history said he was ousted. And I tend to favor the latter. Sorry, Dr. Lehman, may you rest in peace, but there's one thing we German organizations don't like, and that's disorder and Aufruhr, we call it. Everything must be done decently and in order. And if you're a rebel, hit the road, Jack. And I think he They just said, don't let the screen door hit you on the way out the door. I think there were some probably very hard feelings that you'd peel a congregation off this tiny organization that's just growing. So there were, I'm sure, some major hard feelings there. Anyway, Buren's leadership was very, very stormy. Just because he pulled them out does not mean that they could now be free to grow. It still was a house divided. It still was a Lutheran and Reformed congregation. And the Granville Church 3 years later in 1860 split. They had their own civil war, just like our country was about to crack apart in a few months. And on April 9th, the First Presbyterian Church of Granville, Milwaukee County was organized. All this is still happening across the street. Right now, where you're sitting was still one of the Barnt family farms. This is all going on across the street. Their earliest minutes report that 30 members from the Lutheran Reformed Church were received by John Bantley, minister, and William Buren, clerk. So he wasn't even the pastor of this new enterprise. He was just one of the officers. Their first recorded pastor by name was a man named Ernst Kudoby, and what happened to Buren is not known. That's the last track I've ever been able to find of him, that he was the clerk for this new congregation that started. And by the way, that organization is still there. You can view their beautiful building at your leisure. Meanwhile, the Lutheran remnant reorganized, and the centennial history speaks of Pastor Rauch, R-A-U-C-H, as serving the Granville congregation for the next 10 months. But that's almost certainly a misspelling. The 1861 Synodical Convention minutes record that the new president, Johannes Bading, reported that Mr. Rausch, R-A-U-S-C-H, is at present with the congregation in Granville, and he from time to time sends his prepared sermons to me. So once again, Salem, the future Salem Church, is busted down to being served by a candidate, a trainee. But the ministerial assembly discussed Rausch later in that convention, and they decided that he be let go. And there again, what does entlassen mean? Not sure. They were so desperate for workers, the guy must have been really weak. Having a weak guy is better than no guy at all. Who knows if the wheels would have come off of everything and the whole enterprise would have unraveled with no leadership. In 1861, the little congregation petitioned the Wisconsin Synod for readmission and asked for a pastor who could speak German and English. That's amazingly foresighted. This was a largely German farming community back then. There were way more animals than people in Granville. And that they were looking ahead enough to be able to connect with their English-speaking neighbors really shows that this, at its core, this congregation had good instincts. President Mielhäuser assigned candidate Johann Heinrich Sieker, who at the time was still studying at the Gettysburg Seminary. He was still finishing up his work that summer. In August, another 30 members from the sundered congregation joined the Presbyterian Church. Candidate Sieker arrived in September, was examined and ordained and installed, all, kaboom. And at that time, he would have been 23 years old. And I'm going to pause the story here of Salem as we now take a look at this fascinating man named Johann Heinrich Sieker. But I just mentioned that the next summer in its convention in Columbus in 1862, right in the middle of the Civil War, the Wisconsin Synod Convention in Columbus welcomed the Granville Church back into the fold. Still called the Granville Church. You apparently still don't have a name yet. The young Synod's greatest burden for its first 13 years was trying to respond to the enormous need for pastoral manpower without having its own seminary. You have no idea what a dilemma that was. They were a ragtag army. That's the best you can say of it. And the only reason it held together was purely the grace of God. Advertising for pastors in church papers out east was not producing acceptable candidates. This was wilderness here. I mean, Milwaukee had a few amenities, but everything beyond that, roads were bad or non-existent. The travel in winter was brutal. Nobody had any money out here. In fact, the majority of commerce in the 1840s there was no money. This was an almost cashless society because nobody had gold or anything. There was no stable banking system yet, and the majority of commerce was done in kind. They would be swapping stuff. Forest products were almost unsaleable because there was so much of it. Who wanted to pay for timber or lumber? Right? The only possible advantage is if those logs had been milled and you started adding value to them. A very hard life. That first generation of people to tame the wilderness had a very, very hard life. And church life back then was very, very hard as well. Advertising for pastors was not producing acceptable candidates. The practice of assigning young men to study with a pastor just didn't work on a predictable, usable scale. And it led to licensures of some very unworthy men. The pastors themselves were already overworked. Many of them had not just their own charge, but they were going crazy trying. Many of them, for instance, we'll hear about Sieker, was not only the pastor of Salem, but the statistical reports of the WELS list that he had 4 congregations. So clearly he was a supervisor for 3 others besides his own charge here. And besides, the pastor's own meager training did not fit them for theological training. Many of them were graduates of mission societies, which are sort of like Bible institutes. They did not provide anywhere near the kind of training that our seminaries have done for the last 100 and some years. The mission societies produced some desperately needed candidates, but not all of them were Orthodox Lutheran. And so those people that they brought in were a mixed bag, especially the Swiss ones. A new approach was tried with this young man named Sieker. 2 leaders of the somewhat conservative Pennsylvania Synod graciously offered not only free training for Sieker, but financial aid as well, not only tuition, but room and board. One was Dr. William Passavant, who had a fondness for Milwaukee. He established the Passavant Hospital here in Milwaukee. Great compassionate heart for social ministry, which later became the Lutheran Hospital, and that's what I would go to visit people when I first came to Milwaukee. Then it became Good Samaritan, then Sinai Samaritan. Now I think it's called Aurora Sinai. Isn't that right? It's on 12th Street. The other was Dr. C.F. Schaefer of the Gettysburg Seminary, and Sieker was to be their first and last Wisconsin Synod student. So obviously that plan didn't work so well either. And now we meet this amazing man. Johann Heinrich Sieker was born in Schweinfurt, Bavaria. Anybody know, just a little trivia, Schweinfurt was famous in World War II. Anybody know why? Schweinfurt was where the Nazis had their ball bearing factories. Their war production leaders said after the war, if the Allies had bombed Schweinfurt in the early 40s, they would have taken Germany out of the war, because every piece of mechanical equipment that rolled in service of the Nazis depended on ball bearings, and they were all made at Schweinfurt. Belatedly, the Allies found that out, but the Germans were a couple months ahead of them and had relocated these production facilities to caves in mountains, which made them more or less bomb-proof. But the Allies went at it anyway, and waves of B-17 bombers attacked Schweinfurt, which is, of course, deep inside of Germany, with brutal losses. Those are some of the greatest air slaughters, bad news for the Allies, were their attempted bombing raids on Schweinfurt. Just thought you might like to know. But that's all in the future. At that time, Schweinfurt was just a mill town in southern Germany. He was born on October 23rd, 1839, son of Christian and Johanna Schaefer Sieker. Christian was a farmer up north in Westphalia. His mother was the daughter of a shoemaker. Christian Sieker had moved from the poor Westphalian farmland he inherited. He let his brothers have the land to work in a sugar refinery in Schweinfurt. The revolutionary turmoil in Germany, though, from 1847 to 1850, caused Christian a great deal of frustration, and he resolved to emigrate to America. He ultimately had 9 children. I think at that time he had 6, and he was terrified that his boys would get drafted into the army and become sausage in the meat grinder of the wars that were already troubling. I mean, there was not only great wars coming, everybody knew it, but the level of civil strife in that aborted revolution in the 1840s just led parents not to want to sacrifice their children to all this political turmoil. The couple sold all their land and their home at a considerable loss. Obviously, there was great economic turmoil, and would be like force selling your home right now. If I hope, in the name of our dear Lord, that none of you are trying to sell real estate right now. This is a lousy time to be a seller, and if you have to sell your home in a hurry, you are going to take a bath right now, aren't you? That's what happened to the Sieker family. And so with there's now 7 children, they set sail from Bremen in 1850. After weeks of arduous travel, he didn't even know where he was going. He said, "I'm going to America." And when he left Bavaria, people said, "Where?" And he said, "I don't know." He struck up some conversations in their travels north to get to the port of Bremerhaven. And they fell in with some people who said that Wisconsin is the ein goldenes Land. The cows graze in pasture, chest deep. You pick fruit off the trees, and it's like a paradise. So he said, "All right, let's go to Wisconsin." That's all the research he put into it, is the tales from one fellow traveler. And so they burnt up a lot of their money traveling, slogging their way overland. They took one of the very first trains to get from, they took a boat from New York Harbor upriver, took trains in the canal to get to Buffalo, and Great Lakes schooners, finally landed them in Sheboygan. He had decided to buy a farm in rural Manitowoc County because he thought that is the promised land. And land back then, if you would live on it and homestead it, was going for $1.60 an acre. He paid over $5 for it. He just got ripped off, just like probably most of the immigrants who landed in this country got taken advantage of and hustled by the people who got here first and learned the game. So they were fleeced. They paid a fortune for pretty scruffy farmland that was not hardly even improved. It had only begun to be cleared. Most of it was forest. And so the boat puts them down in Sheboygan, doesn't even get them to Manitowoc, and so they had to complete the last leg of that journey, basically chopping their way through virgin forest to a small hut. There at least was a home. It was a little log hut 6 miles from the village of Manitowoc in 1850. They had dreadfully overpaid for their 160 acres, and to make matters worse, Christian fell ill immediately, and he never fully regained his strength. The boys supported the family by cutting shingles from the fir trees in their forest. And young Johann, as about an 11 or 12-year-old, could cut 1,000 shingles a day. Isn't that amazing? I wonder if you could cut 1,000 shingles a day. They would haul them into town with their cow, or later an ox. They'd sell them and then buy what food they could and drag it back out to the hut. To their mother's great anguish, all the treasures they had dragged in their trunks from Germany were all lost due to the dampness from the many roof leaks. It would rain. When it was sunny, she would unpack all her trunks, hang everything out outside and try to dry it out, and finally gave up. She lost everything, all her treasures from her comfortable middle-class life back in Germany. The Sieker family attended the Lutheran church in town Newton, served there at first by Pastor Goldammer, who was an early WELS hero, then by Pastor William Streisgut, then Philip Sprengling. These pastors were as poor as their parishioners. Streisgut later recalled that one winter they had no milk from October until Easter. For the first year, the church met in the log cabin of the public school in Manitowoc, or actually in the township of Newton. That church was 16 feet by 16 feet. Johann Heinrich was confirmed in 1857, and then he followed Pastor Streisgut's urging to prepare for the ministry. He moved into town and he found lodging in the church belfry of the church there. I would assume that would have to be First German, what we now call First German, where Goldammer had continued his instruction. Goldammer went from the country church into the city church. Sieker helped out at the parish school and apparently had quite a knack for teaching, as he was a good communicator, very hard-working young man, and even though his education was pretty raggedy, had a great aptitude for it and applied himself. He had that quality that only German has a word for, Fleiß, and all English translations sort of fall short. If you are fleißig, that was one of the highest characteristics. Diligence does not quite measure up to what the Germans meant by Fleiss. I guess you'd say he busted his butt. That's as close as we can get today. Anyway, at the 1858 Wisconsin Synod Convention that was held at St. John's in Milwaukee, downtown, or what is now 8th and Vliet, the convention approved the progress of 4 ministry candidates, among them Sieker, and resolved that the Synod's Pennsylvania friends be petitioned to accept him as a resident student. Sieker was the only one who was accepted from that plan. The other 3 didn't get to go to Gettysburg. While he was waiting, Sieker was accepted into the home of Pastor Gottlieb Reim in Hellenville for further instruction. He wanted to keep his studies going, and so he then worked with Pastor Reim for a while, who later was to become a Wisconsin Synod president. Sieker finally left for Gettysburg, where he spent 1 year in the college and 2 in the seminary. That was really the accelerated program. Obviously, he had to skip some classes, but these were times of immense hunger for workers, and occasionally people were fast forwarded through the ranks and were given their diplomas even with the short number of credits. This may explain why there are stories that the other students at Gettysburg thought him an arrogant rube from the northwestern frontier. He lived in great poverty. He had to beg a tailor for a coat in which to appear for his final examinations. Those were very important because that would determine whether he would get a position or not that actually paid real money. He received 2 diplomas, one in German on August 24th and one in English on August 26th, signed by none other than Dr. Samuel Simon Schmucker, who conservative Lutherans generally despise and revile as like the Melanchthon of the 1800s, selling out Lutheran integrity. Schmucker believed in what he called American Lutheranism, like it's time for us to stop being so European, and some of the stuff he advocated and would tolerate gagged traditional, more conservative Lutherans. Schmucker's diploma reads, "This is to certify that Mr. John H. Sieker has been in regular connection with the Theological Seminary for 2 years, during all which time his Christian deportment," that's high talk for behavior, "was exemplary, his attention to study assiduous." Isn't that good? That's a pretty good translation of fleißig, isn't it? Assiduous. "And his progress in knowledge entirely satisfactory. He is hereby cordially recommended to the confidence of the Christian public in general and to the Lutheran Church in particular, signed S.S. Schmucker, Chairman of the Faculty and Professor of Didactic and Polemical Theology." Ooh. Didactic means you teach your friends, and polemics mean you love to argue with your enemies. And so the newly examined and called pastor arrived in Granville to his first charge. And now permit me to read a little bit of there is an Ehrendenkmal, I think it was or sometimes the German call it a Festschrift, that was done in German, a copy of which I believe is in the possession of the seminary library, and which the extreme crush of my other jobs in life prevented me from translating for you. Translations exist, I guess, in fragmentary form. I'm grateful to Dan for finding some of the pieces of it. I would think that would be a worthy project of the Salem contingent of the Historical Institute to make sure that his biography is translated and made available in digital form to circulate. So permit me to read a portion of it just to see what it is he walked into when he arrived here. There were by this time, by 1861, there would have been train lines running out here, and there was a West Granville station north of here, so he might have been able at least to get the train part way, and then the rest of it would have been on foot, or if he could have rented a cart, an ox cart, to haul whatever possessions he had. But this is what he walked into. the congregation taken over by Pastor Sieker was more harmed than advantaged by his predecessors. It consisted mostly of Pfälzers from the Pfalz region of southwest Germany, who settled here from Pennsylvania and still spoke the Pennsylvania Pfalz dialect. That made Salem's pioneers a little different from the rest of the WELS early people who tended to be Pomeranian. They were Pomeranians. In fact, some of you may attend some of the activities of the Pomeranian Verein, I guess they call it. There's a big Pomeranian group that centers around Freistadt. Did any of you ever go to any of their stuff? A couple of you have. Yeah, you know what that is. And that's where all my tribe is from. We're all Pomeranians, half of which is still in Germany, but the east lobe of which was annexed by Poland, by the victorious Eastern Allies. Poland got moved roughly 300 or 400 miles westward. The whole country was picked up and redeposited. It was one of the paybacks to the immense suffering that Russia had endured during the war. Russia's suffering outpaced America's by a factor, I'd just say at least 100 to 1. And that annexation of territory was to compensate them for the grievous ruin that they suffered in World War II. And that was something Germany lost. So Pomerania lost half of its territory. Posen and Silesia, which were traditionally historic German regions, were simply annexed into Poland, and its Germanic language and culture just began to evaporate. There's only fragments of it left. But then Russia also stole the eastern 300 miles of Poland. That was considered fair. Anyway, there was hardly a trace of spiritual living, and they were not at all, I'm sorry, I'm reading hand script here. Now I got to go to a little more light. They were not at all accustomed to giving. Even on the day of the installation of the new pastor would have discouraging experiences. After the service, a farmer came up to him and said, "This is our last attempt. We've had enough bad pastors. If you are also good for nothing, then that's it, and we don't want any more." Welcome to Granville. That was less than consoling. The pastors who had installed him took the road back to their homes after the service, and the church members left the church. Remember, we're still in the log church across the street. It's a very humble, crude worship place. And they left the church without concerning themselves for the new pastor. No one greeted him. No one expressed good wishes or a friendly word. No one invited him for dinner. So he was left to his lonely self. With a heavy heart, he reached to the nearby cemetery and wandered back and forth among the graves. His heart directed to him with a capital H, who gave him confidence and who was his fortress. Finally, a neighbor whose farm was adjacent to the church property saw him, and God guided his heart so that the idea would actually occur to him that his pastor might want something to eat, and that he subsequently invited him in. It is extremely lovely and exemplary how on the following Sunday he presented himself and addressed the congregation. And his text was Acts chapter 10, verse 23. And so at this point I'm going to now step up here and read to you a portion of his very first sermon in the log church. Praise be to God, a copy of it still exists. See if I can get myself up there. Whoops, that was holding that up, wasn't it? Oh, now I get it, okay. Had to move the Bible, I'm so sorry. We got to get that back up here. That's an important piece of equipment. Isn't this beautiful? Do you know what this means? This is a beautiful old German, it's called a pulpit fall. It says, Wer euch hört, der höre mich, der höret mich. Whoever is listening to you, speaking to the pastor, is listening to me. That's Jesus' promise that when you speak my words, you no longer are just a human being coming up with your own opinions. When you are listening to a Christian minister speaking God's words, you are listening to God Himself. It's a good little reminder. Could I ask a favor? Does anybody have a pair of reading glasses you could spare for a few minutes? I am half blind. It's a little dim. Clarence has some for me. Let's see what this does. Oh, some water too. Water and glasses. Woohoo! All right, let's try this. Need every advantage I can get. All right. That may just help to get me through. His text was from Acts 10, verse 33. It was the conversation between Peter and Cornelius. And the text begins, So I sent for you immediately, and it was good of you to come. Now we are all here in the presence of God to listen to everything the Lord has commanded you to tell us. Isn't that a good choice of a beginning text? That was Cornelius's open heart saying that he was thrilled that Peter would come to his place, and now he was ready to listen. So here's the first part of Pastor Sieker's inaugural sermon. He's just a young sprout, 23 years old, out here in the wilderness with a congregation angry, dispirited, torn by civil strife, confused about its identity, and poor. Everyone's struggling for survival. Nobody's got much money, and it seems like an unpromising start, except that there are people whom the Lord loves and His mighty word at work. So here goes. Two deeply moved parties are standing here today in this holy place. A congregation whose intense wish for a long time has been to have a preacher in their midst, and I, who have been deemed worthy by the good Lord to fulfill His command to the immortal souls in this portion of the vineyard. Yes, I must say I am deeply moved standing before you today. Not only is this the first congregation after a long period of preparation in which I must bear arms with the Word of God against the enemies of God's kingdom and the enemies of the peace in the hearts of mankind, it is also a congregation in which particular obstacles present difficulties for the preacher's office and scatter his path with thorns instead of roses. I stand here deeply moved, for the significant call of the Lord also came to me. Do not say, I am too young. Rather, you must go where I send you. Go and become a blessing, a light in this congregation, and seek to build it on their holiest belief, so that under it my cross may be planted and their souls may be healed from the poisonous bites of sin. Dear friends, I followed this command. I obeyed the voice of my Savior who called to me. Respect effort, labor, and poverty. For whoever cannot tolerate this is not worthy of me. And so I stand before you, my dear ones, well aware of the difficult responsibility which the preacher must take before God's judgment seat. For does he not need to pasture souls purchased with costly blood? Is he not the guardian of the congregation? If through his unfaith, meaning the speaker, the preacher, if through his unfaithfulness they never hear an earnest warning, will not their blood be demanded of him? It's a quote from, of course, Jeremiah. I am moved today before you because I love my Savior and want to serve him, and I love you. I think that's just a marvelous opening. As if that was not enough change in his life, he was married to Julie Sophie Streiskut, his former pastor's sister, on August 28th. And the biography says it was 1861, but I don't think that's possible. I think that's got to be an error. He was still in Gettysburg that August. That's when he was finishing up his work. And his biography reveals him living in his little blockhouse hut as a bachelor at first, and I wonder if it wasn't 1862 when he was married. His own reminiscences have some incorrect dates in, and so I'm going to put an asterisk behind this date as well. I think that it was, he was a bachelor pastor for some months, and it was the next summer when he was married. My opinion only. I will leave it to detail hounds like Professor Pless to dig through that, or maybe I see a newly retired Professor Sigilko here with lots of time on his hands can nail that down for us. His biography says that his salary for the first year was $200, worth every buck, I'm sure, and often months would go by without any payment from the congregation. He was given an old blockhouse to live in as the parsonage, with a roof so leaky that he had to hold an umbrella while he was studying. And finally, he just snapped and said, "This is nuts." He went out and split his own shingles. Clearly, that was his trade. He knew how to do that. And he reshingled it himself with skills learned as a child. The young pastor not only had to heal the wounds of the congregational split, but lead a major building project as well. That log church was far too small for the rebounding congregation. In 1863, a plot of land across the street, that's where we are now, was donated by member Jonas Barnt from one of the Barnt farms, B-A-R-N-D-T. It was a whole clan. You can still see the plat maps. If you go down to the County Historical Society, there are plat maps of Granville from the 1870s, and you can see the owners of all the farms around here. That's all it was. There was almost no Granville to find. Like, Granville never had a downtown. It never had any kind of town. It was just basically a farm. It was a state of mind. It was not a location. You couldn't go to Granville. You could just get in it. There was no there, as they say. And so a Cream City brick church was built in the Italianate style. It was dedicated on October 28th, 1863, right in the middle of the Civil War. The next month is when Abraham Lincoln would give his famous Gettysburg Address. And that college where Sieker had studied was not just an innocent bystander to the turning point of the war. Many historians call the Battle of Gettysburg the high water mark of the Confederacy. Lee's armies actually invaded the North and were possibly going to make a drive on Washington, not from the south, but actually from the northwest. And that battle could have gone a number of different ways. On the second day, they almost succeeded. The Confederate attackers almost succeeded in outflanking the Union Army, and once they'd gotten behind the lines would have caused a massive disruption. Some of you know the story of the way in which that left end of the Union flank was able to fight off the attackers, wave after wave of attackers, and actually ran out of ammunition, affixed bayonets, and actually made a charge down the hill and drove the Confederacy back until they could be reinforced. It was a close thing. It may still have been won if Lee had not done the suicidal thing of attacking up the middle on day 3, the famous Pickett's charge, in which he fell into the same trap he so often had lured the Union into attacking a prepared position uphill, and he paid bitterly for that miscalculation, and the Confederacy had to retreat. That was in July of 1863. So in October, they're dedicating their new church, and then the next month, Lincoln consecrated Gettysburg to be a cemetery for the fallen dead, and it's now a national monument, an amazing place. Could I just ask, how many of you have been to the Gettysburg Historical Site? I hope every one of you can go before you die. It is just a piece of America that tells volumes of who we are as a country. Anyway, all that is going on out east, and out here we have a new church. You know, though, don't you, that much of what you're looking at now are later additions. That steeple sitting up on the roof was not the original. That came in the 20s in the English Gothic style. These stained glass windows came in the 20s. Those are sort of art glass style that was popular around the time of the First World War. These were plain panes of glass, small pane, clear glass. Oh, like that. Are those the clear ones? Oh, outstanding. I suppose for the fun of it, when you finally take the sheathing off the outside, you'll leave them clear, I suppose, just to show what they originally looked like. Obviously, the blonde pews you're sitting in are new, but this building was built before the sort of liturgical revival took place in Lutheranism that made the altar once again a focal point. This still has some of its Reformed flavor, where the central feature was the pulpit, and the altar wasn't really an altar. They just called that the table. This design that you see shows the early Lutheran / Reformed flavor of how the people thought of themselves. In Reformed circles, the sermon is the main thing, and the Lord's Supper is less important than it is to Lutherans. So I'm glad that we are able to illustrate that. Professor Edward Moldenke from the brand new Northwestern University gave the first sermon in this building. Present also were, they called him Senior Mielhäuser, the former president of the WELS, Streisguth, his now brother-in-law, and Dr. Passavant came out all the way from Pennsylvania to be here for the event. Sieker had quickly become a leader in advocating for the Wisconsin Synod to develop its own college and seminary. He was a leader in fundraising, and the minutes of the 1863 convention show his argumentation for his proposed location of the school in Watertown. He directed the attention of the delegates to the harmful influences the students would be exposed to in large commercial cities such as Milwaukee. In retrospect, Watertown isn't so bad, but I think there have been many a parent schlepping their kids to the New Ulm, Minnesota prairie who regretted they're not anywhere near a major airport, I'll tell you that. The final vote on the two sites, Milwaukee 19, Watertown 45. That is why essentially the center of gravity for the WELS was Watertown, Wisconsin, and emotionally in some ways still is. The WELS never had a central headquarters that had an emotional grip. And as much as anything, I believe it was Watertown, Wisconsin, is the emotional heart of the WELS. And that's why there was such turmoil when, 15 years ago now, the college, the pastoral college, was moved. As much as anything, that represented the taproot as far as geography goes, as a sense of place for the Wisconsin Synod. And most lay people thought, yeah, that makes sense, I don't care. But the clergy took it really hard, because that Watertown was kind of their mental home. And that all traces back to that convention's decision and Sieker's voice, one of the strongest. He was repeatedly elected to the seminary's board of directors. Still just a kid, you know, man, he's born in 1839. Held the office of secretary, and the house in Watertown that was the Wisconsin Seminary's first site is marked with a plaque near its front door. Have any of you ever seen that house? You know where it is? I think it's on 4th Street, where as you're going out of town, It's on the, as you're leaving Watertown, it'll be on the left-hand side. There's a small little historic house with a big plaque. This is the site of the first Wisconsin Synod Seminary. Started in a house. For a while, Sieker served as the Synod's salaried salesman of perpetual scholarships. A terribly poor idea, fiscally unsound, that caused a lot of friction before it was discontinued. The statistical report in 1865, the year the Civil War ended, for the Granville Church lists 4 congregations under his watch. I don't know what the other 3 were, but the guy sure did not lack for things to do. 30 confirmations, 13 marriages, 22 burials, and 77 baptisms. It would only accelerate. It is hard for us today to imagine what church life was like as the waves of German immigrants flooded through here. You didn't have to have an evangelism committee in your church to do outreach. People were pouring in. You didn't have to be good at evangelism any more than the Israelites had to be a good shot if they wanted quail to eat the day the Lord sent quail for supper. All you had to do was hold out your tennis racket and swat them down as they flew low where God made them available, so everybody ate quail. My congregation in the 1880s was baptized, St. Marcus down in Milwaukee, just a few years later, was baptizing 200 children a year. St. John's, by then on Vliet Street, was baptizing 300 children a year. Now, the infant mortality rate, of course, took some of those in their first year, and there are many little graves in Union Cemetery in Milwaukee. My great-great-grandfather, Ernst Jeske, I always get those rolled up. Carl Jeske, excuse me. My great-great-grandfather Carl was a Milwaukee construction contractor back then. He and his wife had 8 children, but there were 4 more, 12 in all, 4 more who never made it past age 1.5, and there are 4 tiny graves in Union Cemetery because of infant mortality. In 1867, Sieker accepted a call to serve at Trinity Lutheran Church in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is the mother congregation of the Minnesota Synod. At this time, the Minnesota Lutherans and the Wisconsin ones were not united. They were friendly, but were not connected with each other. You know that, right? I kind of wonder whether the blowing up of his enthusiastic scholarship sales and the hard feelings that engendered maybe made him a little bit weary. He had maybe fried some of his relationships here, and the arguing over that. He enthusiastically wanted to build up Northwestern University, as it was called back then. I wonder if maybe he just thought, it's time for me to move on. Or just in general, there are often not very long pastorates. The need for skilled leadership and labor was so intense that it seemed like a lot of the pastors back in those days were moved around a lot just to cover holes. It was like a shell game, just to try to patch things up and keep moving. And if a congregation had had steady pastoral leadership for 5 years, that was considered like you've had your treat. Now somebody else gets a good guy, and now you can struggle a little bit because you're together, you're functioning. And I didn't write that stuff down. I hope nobody's recording this. Those are just my opinions. I kind of wonder if he maybe left a little wounded that his scholarship plans were not embraced by everybody in the WELS. Pastors can be cruel to each other. We're under the surface, we're a mean bunch of people, and when we don't think lay people are listening, we can get ugly towards each other. Anyway, he goes to Trinity Lutheran Church in St. Paul, which had been founded by the father of Minnesota Lutherans, Father Heyer, and he became their 3rd pastor. Trinity was growing rapidly, and during Reverend Sieker's time, the congregation purchased a lot 2 blocks from the state capitol. He ended up leaving Trinity before that was built, but they had a fabulous building right in the heart of downtown. Trinity, if I can comment on their story, just did not figure out how long-term to build a thriving downtown church. It's harder than it looks. The fact that our Grace Church is thriving where it is not automatic. Pastor Huebner and Pastor Lindemann's leadership has brought great blessings. They were in long decline because it's a whole new way to figure out how to do church. When you're a downtown church, The downtown ones that were first planted actually had residential neighborhoods around them. And eventually, as downtown grows and businesses develop and commercial structures take over, your neighborhood disappears. And you better figure out a new way to have church life, because people aren't walking to church anymore. And Grace downtown has done it. Trinity did not figure out what to do. They lost their historic building. I hope as my anniversary booklet goes around, you can spot a few pictures of that gorgeous Trinity Church in downtown St. Paul. It's gone now, and even the new one that they built some blocks away in the 1950s, even that is gone. Trinity now has had to merge, and it has disappeared as an independent organization. Relations with the Missouri Synod in Minnesota were strained because in the mid-60s a faction had broken off of Trinity and formed Zion Lutheran Church, charging that the Minnesota Synod was too lax. Missouri, believe it or not, the Missourians in those days were kind of rock-ribbed. They were hard guys, and there was some real friction with what they called the parochial boundaries. You know, you weren't supposed to work each other's territory, like you're working my side of the street, and it was a little frosty. In 1869, at age 30, he was elected, Sieker was elected the third president of the Minnesota Synod. That sounds like a spectacular coup or a phenomenal honor, and in some ways it was, but the Minnesota Synod back then only had about 24 pastors, so, you know, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, I guess they say. He rose to the top and led them for the rest of his Minnesota time. And he leads the Minnesota Synod to establish fellowship with the Wisconsin Synod. There was a kinship there because he had come from Wisconsin. In 1871, he led the Minnesota Synod out of the General Council, which was like a federation of mid-level Lutherans between the hard guy Missourians and the much more liberal General Synod. The General Council tried to have a halfway point, but there were flaws in it that finally the true Lutherans just said, we cannot tolerate these loose ends, sometimes called the 4 points. By 1872, the next year, the Minnesota-Missouri irritation had calmed down, and Sieker became Minnesota's delegate to the founding convention of the Synodical Conference, which was held here in Milwaukee at St. John's Church, Bodding's Church, in July. There were 6 synods that originally joined: the Missouri Synod, the Wisconsin Synod, Minnesota Synod, the Illinois Synod. Most of you never heard of that. That didn't have a long independent existence. That was a very good group and were mentored and fellowshipped well, and they were eventually absorbed into the the Missouri Synod's Illinois districts. The Ohio Synod, which later ended up in the ALC and then became part of the ELCA today, and the Norwegian Synod. The little rump piece of which the conservative piece has today become the ELS. The rest of the Norwegians and almost all the rest of the Scandinavians have ended up in the ELCA. All right, almost done. Hang on, we're coming around the corner. In 1876, he was called to St. Matthew's Lutheran Church in Manhattan, in New York City. It is the oldest continuous Lutheran congregation in America. It, at that time, was experiencing an enormous wave of German immigration. They had 300 students in their school, and they had over 1,000 in their Sunday school. Manhattan, of course, was just choked. The Lower East Side was where a lot of new immigrants to America ended up. It was a place of perpetual poverty, and there was a little Germany there that St. Matthew's and its daughter congregations, including St. Mark's in Manhattan, were eagerly serving. St. Matthew's had been founded as a Dutch Lutheran congregation in 1657. As far as we know, it's the earliest congregation. The first Lutheran pastor in North America. His German spelling was Johann Ernestus Gutwasser, and I don't speak Dutch, but his actual name, as he would have heard it, would have been something like Jan Goetwater. And it was on Broadway, just north of Wall Street. In fact, their first site, have you ever seen Trinity Episcopal Church in the Wall Street area? That is the site of where they were gathering. Wall Street was called Wall Street because it was a wall. That's what kept the Indians out. The Dutch settlement was below the wall. It was just on the tip of Manhattan. And the Bowery was called a Bowery because it was a farm. That happens to be the Dutch word for a farm. You know, a Bauer in German is a farmer. So the Bauerei in Dutch was the farm. So that was the nearest farm, what is now called the Bowery in New York, place for drunks. It was named Trinity Lutheran originally, and one of its illustrious pastors was Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, who served in the pre-Revolutionary War years of in the 1750s. There always were tensions with the Dutch and German language. Finally, Dutch withered away when the Dutch presence in New York kind of melted away. And then they never resolved the German and English split, and they often were one parish with two sites. And the Germans split off and formed Christ Church, but then they reunited after the war and moved to Broome Street. Then they moved in 1913, they moved again to 145th and Convent up in Harlem. Not such a great idea. Harlem changed drastically, of course, after World War I. In 1945, they merged with Messiah Church and moved to their campus on Sherman Street. In 2005, their school died. And in 2006, they sold their church property and leased space from an ELCA church and moved into its cornerstone building on Bennett Avenue. And their stats today list that St. Matthew's in Manhattan has 95 members left. So ironically, they're still in Manhattan, but they've moved all the way from the southern tip and sort of hopped their way up the island. And now the remnants of what's left of this once enormous congregation are way up at the tip. I also hasten to add one little story that I stumbled on that some of you know about. Hey, if I say the word General Slocum, does that ring a bell with anybody? Let's just have a little survey here. What is the General Slocum? Who knows? Nobody knows. Awesome. I'm telling you a story you don't know. About a dozen years before the Titanic, or maybe 10 years before the Titanic went down, General Slocum was a beat-up old paddle wheeler that was used for excursion runs. And Manhattan, as you know, had an underdeveloped park system in the 1800s and with way too many people squashed in too little space. So summer outings were enormous. That's why Coney Island became so big. There was nowhere for these squashed hot people to go in summer. And the church picnics, they had no property. Manhattan, of course, was tightly built up. And so primarily St. Mark's Lutheran Church, but also members of St. Matthew's, chartered the General Slocum, this beat-up old paddle wheeler, and 1,000 of their members, of primarily St. Mark's but also St. Matthew's, loaded on, I think in 1902 or 04, I forget the year, for an excursion to Long Island to go to have a day in the park to get out of the heat and congestion of the city. And it was a rattle trap, and it turned into a death trap. And it became our worst maritime disaster, worse than the Titanic. I don't know why that story doesn't get told. And it caught fire. Some moron probably threw a cigarette into a waste bin that had oily rags in it or something. And the fire just shot up through one of the stairwells, and everything that could go wrong did go wrong. The captain was aware of the fire, but didn't want to make for land right away. About a mile up the East River was a dock, and he said, I'm going to take a run for the dock so we can get everybody off in an orderly fashion. They never made it. The fire just exploded through this old wooden rattle trap, and the fire hoses, which all had been certified as functioning, were rotten. The rubber simply burst when the first surge of water went through, and every last fire hose just exploded into worthlessness. The life jackets that they passed out and made the children put on were made of cork, and the cork had long since rotted, and it no longer had air pockets. It was now just mud that as soon as it got wet became waterlogged and became death collars on these children and simply took them to the bottom. Over 1,000 people perished. The boat sank in the East River and tipped over, hurling people in. A few survived. The carnage was immense. There were at least 250 funerals, mass funerals at St. Mark's in Manhattan, and some at St. Matthew's as well. And today there still is the cemetery that the early German Lutherans bought in Long Island, in what's now Queens. And there is a huge monument there to the victims of the General Slocum disaster. Just thought you might like to know. Anyway, in 1881, Sieker was pulling this congregation to a more conservative theological position. Up till that time, St. Matthew's had been in the New York Ministerium, which has ended up in the ELCA, the most liberal wing of us Lutherans. And Sieker believed he was called there on purpose to orient them to a more confessional stance. So in 1881, he personally joined the Missouri Synod, but he kept his WELS ties going. He sent his sons to Northwestern College. What do you think of that? Adolphus and Otto graduated from Northwestern in 1891 and Henry in 1896. And in New York, in his years there, he recruited 30 young men for the pastoral ministry. I think that's pretty awesome. In 1885, Sieker led St. Matthew's out of the New York Ministerium into the Missouri Synod, and that year he founded the Concordia Institute out of his school, the St. Matthew's Academy. He's a phenomenal advocate, always, of course, for Christian education. And then 8 years later, they outgrew the St. Matthew's campus, and the Concordia Institute moved out to Westchester County, where it today is known as what? Concordia Bronxville. It's one of the stars in the Concordia University system. In 1904, he died and was succeeded by St. Matthew's assistant pastor, his son, Otto. The end.
Thank you very much for giving us a presentation, bringing us back to our roots as a congregation and as a synod.